Australia is a nation which enjoys some of the highest living standards in the world, and whilst there are some serious issues of poverty prevalent in Indigenous communities, most Australians will have little to no contact with true poverty on home soil. As well as this, we are fortunate enough to have one of the least corrupt governments in the world, and no history of large-scale conflict within our borders. This can make it easy to forget how poverty, political tyranny, and conflict remain a part of daily life for millions of people in many parts of the world. One continent which has seen much more than its fair share of each of these three problems is Africa. Africa has experienced unrest in its various territories, particularly since their colonisation by major European empires throughout the 19th and early 20th century, a period called the Scramble for Africa. Many atrocities committed during this time were able to take place without intervention from an international body concerned with the protection of human rights, simply because such an organisation did not yet exist. In 1945, the United Nations formed to replace the League of Nations as an international body with the primary intentions of promoting world peace, protecting human rights, providing humanitarian aid, and supporting social and economic development, particularly in developing nations. The UN is a huge organisation that is made up of just over 190 member states, representing nearly every country in the world, and carries a lot of credibility, but it faces huge challenges in its goal of a peaceful, poverty-free world. Due to the plethora of complex issues socially, economically, politically, and in terms of conflict in the various nations of Africa, the UN has been very involved in this continent. Now, after nearly 70 years as an international organisation, what can be said of the UN's success in their ultimate goals to eradicate poverty, political tyranny, and conflict on the African continent? We will begin with the sprawling problem of poverty in Africa. Poverty can be defined in general terms as a state of being without the basic constituents of life, such as healthy food, clean water, and shelter. Other problems that exacerbate poverty include lack of education, lack of employment, social inequality, disease, war, oppression, and many other factors. In 2000, the UN compiled a list of 8 goals called the Millennium Development Goals Programme, or the MDG, as a multifaceted global operation to not only alleviate the symptoms of poverty, like disease, malnourishment, child mortality, etc., but also to combat the broader systemic causes for it, such as inequality, lack of education, unsustainable industry, and poor international relations. So what did they promise? The UN promised that by 2015 they would do the following. They promised that they would halve both the number of people living on below $1.25 US a day and the number of people suffering from hunger. They promised they would achieve universal primary education for all children in the world. They said they would promote gender equality and empower women in education, politics, and the civil service. They promised to reduce child mortality rates by 2/3 from the 1990 figure. They also said that they would reduce by 3/4 the maternal mortality rate compared to 1990 and give universal access to reproductive health. They said they would halt and begin to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS and malaria, and they said they would have a universal treatment for those suffering from HIV/AIDS. Their 7th goal was to ensure environmental sustainability, and their final was to develop global partnership and development. Now, based on the most recent data available, what state is the better part of Africa actually in?
Have they decreased hunger and economic poverty?
For the majority, i.e. sub-Saharan Africa, this has not been achieved and in the current state of decline it is not likely to. On top of this, sub-Saharan Africa still suffers from widespread malnourishment and is not likely to eradicate half of it by 2015.
What about universal primary education?
Consequently, the prospect of reaching the UN goal in terms of primary education is uncertain.
And gender equality?
Unfortunately not. In 2010, both Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa were quite far from their goals.
Child mortality?
North Africa? Yes. Sub-Saharan Africa? No.
What are the UN likely to achieve by 2015?
Well, that really depends on where you are. In North Africa, they are on track to, or have already achieved, halving their economic poverty levels, universal primary school enrolment, their goals for child mortality, zero malaria, fresh water access, and some parts of their international standing like their debt repayments. In Sub-Saharan Africa, however, basically none of their goals are likely to be realised in all target countries. The situation is clearly extremely dire, and in viewing this information it can be easy to think of the UN as incompetent, but we do need to cut them a certain amount of slack. Many of the forces proliferating poverty in Africa are simply beyond anyone's control. This is made apparent from their work in one of the most problematic nations of Africa, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has the lot: a tyrannical dictator, civil unrest, disease and poverty rife, drastic economic problems, and prevalent social inequality. In the late 1990s, Robert Mugabe, the dictator of Zimbabwe, confiscated farms from the experienced white farmers and redistributed them to the black population in a move to reverse the colonization. This is all well and good, but the new black farmers had little to no training in farming, and for the next 10 years, until 2009, the economy saw a sharp drop in food production, the collapse of the banking system, and by late 2009, when the records stopped being made, an inflation rate of 6.5 sextillion%. Naturally, with an inflation rate that looks like this, international loan repayment is not a big priority. As a result, relations between Zimbabwe and other nations suffered, as did Zimbabwe's prospects of acquiring future loans. The national currency has become so worthless that there are prominent proponents for the adoption of the Chinese yuan as the new national currency. Here we have a situation where a leader has been so unruly and the damage caused has been so great that the UN simply cannot be expected to repair it in the 15 years alone. The UN's powers are simply not great enough to stop terrible policies from being implemented by leaders who are determined to see them enacted. The UN rely on a competent leader having the best interests of his people in mind when making decisions. Unfortunately, this is not always a given in Africa. Zimbabwe is also a good example of our next topic. How did the UN deal with political tyranny? The account I have just provided of their lack of control over Mugabe and his systematic destruction of Zimbabwe's economy may serve as a good indicator of the UN's powers over some African dictators. They often prove ineffectual. The UN are concerned with promoting good governance in developing nations, but cannot overrule a leader's policies if they are detrimental to the functioning of that nation. This is considered too intrusive. As a result of the UN's limited control, Zimbabwe saw a loss of 40% of their GDP in the years following 2000. Another move on the part of the UN in terms of their treatment of Mugabe is perplexing. Despite his atrocious record of human rights offences upon his own people, which has led to many countries denying him entry within their borders, the UN named him the Tourism Ambassador of the UN's World Tourism Organization, a prestigious position. When Gaddafi announced in 2011 that he would destroy those participating in the rebellion against his leadership, even threatening civilian lives if need be, the UN and international community was forced to pay attention. They instead a no-fly zone, the questionability of which I will deal with later, but also very significantly referred Gaddafi to the International Criminal Court, the ICC. This may seem like a run-of-the-mill response to seek justice for a man who is by all accounts a criminal. However, it had another effect. By labelling Gaddafi an international criminal, it sets the precedent of global accountability for Gaddafi's treatment. It is effectively making every government of the world aware that he is to be denounced. That has the effect of completely destroying Gaddafi's prospects of escape and exile, i.e. a peaceful resolution of the situation. The UN effectively shut off Gaddafi's escape route. They cornered him. And what does one expect a warlord to do when cornered? Lash out. Gaddafi was left in a situation where his only way out was to fight, which meant more civilian bloodshed. This is despite the UN's objective to protect civilians in such civil conflicts as this one. This case of mismanagement seems quite blatant and no doubt could have been avoided. Unless there was more to this case than we know, it appears that the UN were not nearly as effective as they could have been in protecting civilians in this civil conflict. So in all, it seems that the UN's management of political tyrants is marred by both lack of power in the case of Mugabe and lack of forethought in the case of Gaddafi. Perhaps the greatest threat to human rights in Africa is conflict. Unfortunately, Africa is a continent which has seen and continues to experience some of the most horrific conflicts of human history. One particularly traumatic experience was the genocide that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. This event was the culmination of many years of intense hostility between the two major ethnic groups of Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. The genocide was the highly organised nationwide attempted eradication of the Tutsis by the Hutus over a period of about 100 days from April 1994. In this short period of time, an as of yet unknown number of Tutsis between 500,000 and perhaps over 1 million were murdered by fellow civilians participating in the ethnic cleansing. Needless to say, during this terrifying period, horrendous violations of human rights were carried out en masse, and what was most disturbing is that it happened with the attention of the international community without intervention. At the time of the genocide, the UN had peacekeeping troops present at the very same location that the genocide was occurring. Some troops were killed attempting to protect victims, and in response, rather than reinforcing them, the UN Security Council opted to withdraw. As a result, the peacekeeping force was too restricted in its numbers, resources, and instructions to prevent the genocide, and despite knowing this, the UN Security Council voted to withdraw troops rather than bolster their numbers to save civilian lives. One particularly horrible case was one where UN forces guarding over 1,500 Tutsi civilians surrounded by Hutu forces in a school were ordered to withdraw. As a consequence, the Hutus invaded the school and killed all present Tutsis. 2 weeks after the killings began, the UN Security Council chose to reduce the forces present from 2,000 to just 270 soldiers told to remain and observe but not interfere with the killings. It was not until the killing was effectively over, thanks to the response of a Tutsi force from Uganda, that any significant number of UN soldiers arrived. A French force under a UN mandate set up a safe zone in the southwest of Rwanda called the Turquoise Zone. However, this was not until mid-June, when the worst of the killing was already over. As well as this, Operation Turquoise was only providing refuge for those escaping the genocide, and was not proactive in stopping it. The treatment of the Rwanda genocide is a great source of shame for the UN, who did not respond with any effectual measures to halt this horrific event as it was unfolding. The response to the Rwandan genocide represents a huge failure on the part of the UN in their responsibility to protect human rights. In all, the UN is struggling in Africa. They are not likely to achieve all of their goals in respect to poverty due to their lack of influence over not only dictators, but also larger, less tangible forces influencing recovery and development. As well as this, the UN seems at times ineffectual in managing Africa's problems with political tyrants, whether it be again a lack of power, as is the case with Mugabe, or a lack of insight, as with Gaddafi. Finally, the UN has a poor history of dealing with conflict in African nations, proving shamefully uncommitted in Rwanda and vague and indecisive in Libya. To their merit, the UN exercise transparency and accountability in the way they address challenges past, present, and future. Despite the huge obstacles, their mission is not one without hope, and in time they are likely to prove instrumental in bringing about a more peaceful world.